Okay, good morning everyone, and full points to everyone for making it to I was very surprised last night when I was checking the time that I had to speak, and it was at 10 to 9, so I hope you were as shocked as I was, so well done for getting here. Yes, I'm Annabel Astbury. I'm the Head of Digital Education at the ABC. I have an aversion to PDFs and badges, so if you're expecting lots of badges and rewards here, I'm sorry, that's not going to be part of my talk today. I was also thinking yesterday when I was listening to Adrian Cam, who gave a very beautiful sort of pastiche and story about being on the sort of teenage basketball team and about game playing. And I was trying to think of something that sort of resonated with me, and I didn't have anything as nearly as inspirational. And there were only two things that I could come up with. In year 11, I actually wagged school, and I was listening to the radio, and there was a quiz game on the radio, and the question was, to which Greek island did Odysseus hail from? And I knew the answer, and I rang up and I won $50. But I couldn't actually share that with anyone because I was wagging school. But thanks to Chris Christopoulos, who was one of my teachers for classics. And the other occasion that I could think of, when I was very young, I used to play Atari games, and does anybody know what this game is? Pitfall. Yeah, it's Pitfall. And I remember for months I would play this game, and I actually was so proud of one of my achievements. I took a picture of I've still got the physical photo of picture of the television screen when I finally mastered, as a 10-year-old or however old I was, to get past these blessed crocodiles, and that, you know, the strategy to actually, you know, jump on their heads, and that's how you're going to get across the lake. And to me, that was sort of like the biggest sort of inspirational achievement. So if you can sort of, you know, humour me now and give me a round of applause, that would be really great. I'm also surprised that the sorts of games that I'm interested in, considering that I'm a bookmaker's daughter, it's a wonder that I didn't sort of, you know, become involved in casino games or things like that, but it's never actually sort of, you know, sparked my interest. So it's certainly not as inspirational as Adrian's, but I've played games all my life, and that was just one little story I wanted to deal with. But I'm here today to talk about ABC Splash, which is an educational portal, which is a sort of title that I have a bit of an aversion to because when you think of portal, it sort of comes across as a sort of staid sort of area that you think, you know, is open for educational games. So ABC Splash, the story so far with ABC Splash is that at the end of last year, Ministers Garrett and Conroy announced that there would be $19 million worth of funding for the ABC and Education Services Australia to build an educational portal. And it had a twofold purpose. One was to certainly support students and families, students, families and teachers for the implementation of the incoming Australian curriculum, which will be introduced into schools from the beginning of next year in the majority of states and territories. And the second component was to sort of also provide some resources that would also demonstrate the capability of the NBN and the potential of what an NBN can sort of have, particularly in the areas of education. We launched a couple of weeks ago, a very soft launch. We haven't done any sort of advertising. We've done one mail drop to schools just to let them know. We really wanted teachers to sort of get on board in this sort of soft launch phase, and we've been really overwhelmed by the responses that we've had. So we're getting very consistent traffic, 23,000 page views a day, which is, you know, quite consistent, and this is without any sort of advertising, and return traffic as well, which is, so we've already got you know, a customer base as it was. Hang on, why does this? Can someone give me a hand here? If you can just get to the previous slide. There are two components to Splash and the way that we've actually structured it. Essentially, in the first instance, it is a media library and there was a lot of research done by the Innovation Division, which is the division in which I work at the ABC, about what sort of resources teachers and students wanted. And there was an overwhelming sort of response that, you know, because of the ABC's reputation and the variety and quality of content that they had available in their archives, that would be very useful for teachers and students. So in one way, it's not really an entertainment offering, it is an educational offering. The second and more exciting part, and that's what I'm here to talk about today, is not just the media library, but some of that funding was set aside to develop very media-rich and interactive resources that would be eventually housed on the site. Now, at the moment, we don't have those resources because we're still in the middle of actually constructing them. And I'll be talking about some of those resources a little bit later. I might just add that the development of those resources are all going to be continued by the ABC and ESA. We have made a public call to the independent production industry, and our most recent call in July sort of reaped 129 responses, which had a very sort of very broad, some very interesting ideas that came from the independent production industry and from educational technologists as well, to help us sort of decide what's going to be furnished in this second stage. But I do want to talk about some of the challenges that we face, and this is not necessarily talking about the content, and I would like to sort of open this up for discussion, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to do this, because I think it's an area in which people have a lot of very strong viewpoints and sort of contemplations as well. And just the games continue. One thing that I'm aware of in working in educational technology or working with education and technology is that they're often separated. And I think this example here, this is just one of those sort of hand puzzles that I was doing at my mother-in-law's the other week, is that I think it's reflective of almost like pathological tenacity that you have to have when you're working in the education space, because the rate of change is so slow. And that's just because of the nature, because you have such a broad audience to sort of contend with. So the challenges, I think, and the biggest challenge is that we have these three key audience segments to satisfy, and that each of those audience segments have very different expectations of what digital education is, or what education is, and how technology can be used very well for education. So we've got students, teachers and families all with different expectations and experiences. And this was touched on yesterday by Adrian, hinted in toward another sort of aspect by Hamish Curry from the library yesterday, and even from Chris, who was talking about his experiences with quantum. So I think when we're thinking about what sort of games and what's going to be useful, what's going to be used, and what's going to be also accepted by the broad range of audiences that we have, is that we have to sort of go back to considering where our audiences are. And I just wanted to, when I was thinking about this a few weeks ago, is that we almost send mixed signals. When we think of educational technology, or when we think of games in education, students hang out in particular environments. The under 10 group is very well catered to. It's very well accepted. So for example, you have the trusted brands of, you know, like the ABC with Play School or with Reading Eggs. Parents are willing, I'm one of them, who's willing to pay out, you know, the monthly fee, you know, because I want my child to be literate and numerate. I'm willing to pay for those. They hang out at a very early age in social networks like Club Penguin, which has, you know, the tens of millions of users, of registered users. Now, I know that's only registered users as opposed to active users, but that caters to that very young group. As students get older, you know, they start hanging out in different sort of networks, more sophisticated, sort of, I suppose, the freedom of a network that is actually presented there. And so my 10-year-old, who was here yesterday, who is at the moment, and for the last 18 months has been, quite involved in Minecraft. He's used to different sort of social networks that sort of, appear out of that. When he's at school and he's been given these very sort of safe, controlled environments to go to, they're too babyish for him. So when my son was 7, he was intimate. He would come home and go on mathletics. He would go on to reading eggs. Now, there's no way on earth that he would actually even go to those spaces, even though they're sort of freely available to him. And I think that's where we're missing. There's a really big gap in the educational market to catering for older students. Because in one way, we're sort of sending teachers and families and the community send mixed messages to students about where it's right to hang out for educational spaces. So as they get older, we say it's really good, part of your education to hang out in spaces, say like BBC Learning, where there's lots of flash games and things for rote learning and skill development, perhaps revising for exams. But we're not really comfortable with you playing World of Warcraft or Minecraft or relinquishing the control for the freedom of creativity in those spaces. That's not to say that it's not happening, because we know that people like Dr. Bronwyn-Stuckey, we know people like Peggy Shee who work very successfully using commercial games in the educational space. But as students get older, and especially in that year 9 and 10 group, which is a very sort of hard group to sort of, crack, is that as students get into year 9 and 10 and they're preparing for their post-compulsory education, which is usually exam-based and reliant upon certification, is that they get a mentality that, well, I shouldn't be playing games because that's not about serious education. That's not going to get me my results in my VCE exam or my HSC exam. So in one way, they're sort of, we don't want to be part of the sort of immature sort of game set. We're up for serious study. So I think there are contradictory messages that are sort of set. Yes, it's great to go to Khan Academy because you've got 20 million lectures there that can tell you about simple numbers. Has anyone watched the simple numbers on Khan Academy? I couldn't really understand it. After about 2 minutes, I went, this is not very simple at all. But, they're very sort of didactic lectures which are being presented. So this is one of the challenges that we have to match. When we look at the use of games, we know that students, particularly in that older area, are playing in very sort of dynamic sort of environments. And the one that I'm just most absolutely fascinated by is that in this 13 to 15-year-old age group, Stardoll has 200 million registered users. Now, obviously now it's 100 million registered users. We know that they might not necessarily be active users. Stardoll's been around, for quite a few years, which in one way sort of might suggest that, this younger age group, they stick with the game that they know. Stardoll, basically it's a dress-up game. And I wouldn't mind sort of looking at some of these spaces to see how we can adapt them to educational settings. And that might have, sort of different formations. And what my fantasy idea, because I come from a history background, is that for Stardoll, I would love to have an historical dress-up. How would you use your historical knowledge and imagination to perhaps, dress up the different, Christian crusaders to Muslim crusaders, for example. Marie Antoinette, or looking at the French court, and so such. I usually get laughed out of the room, but I'm saying, well, it's an idea that sort of resonates with the audience that we're trying to target. When the other message with games, and where teachers sort of resonate with, is that they can see the value of games, and particularly in the higher education market. But when we look at the use of games in the higher education market, it's usually for the means to the end. So it might be, particularly in the medical area, it's about the virtualisation of procedure, or the recreation of a hazardous situation, for example, and how you react in those sort of situations. It's not so much the use of commercial games. But even this idea of the virtualisation of education and perhaps, using simulations to sort of recreate situations doesn't necessarily come across, it doesn't pass down into secondary school, and it still hasn't. And it's something, even though it's been in the Horizon report that virtual worlds are the next best thing in K-12 education, it still has never eventuated because you just don't have the buy-in from the teachers. So I think the other area of the audience that we have to consider are families and what the families' expectations are. For that under 10 audience, as I said, parents of what resonates with the parent is, and when I mean care about, I mean what resonates with them in terms of their students, their child's education. It's about being literate and numerate. Like, I mean, to me, you care about your kids being happy and healthy. That's the main thing. And then you want them to be literate and numerate and be good citizens and such. But whenever education is mentioned in the press, it's NAPLAN results. The image on the left is a school report from 1922. It's not dissimilar to the idea of what resonates with parents now when those NAPLAN results come through. So when we look at images of the family and students happening together, it's always a family helping and engaging with the young child. I challenge you to find an image of parents helping a 16-year-old in a caring sort of manner like this one up here. It's impossible. I've also told my child that when he's 16, that's what I'm going to do. I've also threatened to dance at the school disco tonight, which he's not very impressed about. But what can we do? So we are in a very fortunate and an amazing position with this particular project to sponsor some innovative games and very rich media sort of interactive tools for students. I think with video, video in the education setting has to be revolutionised. It has to be more than Khan Academy lectures and with the American quizzes on the right-hand side about, how students have retained. That's not actual interaction with video. This particular group here, Interlude FM, do a lot of doing some very good, interesting work with video and real-time interaction with video, which has some sort of gamified elements. I suggest you look at, some of the wonderful things that they've got there. And one of the first projects that we're actually sponsoring is a 3D interactive, a 3D single-player game called Zoom, which is essentially a physics game. So the challenge for us is, it's not purely an entertainment title. It does have to sort of match all of the requirements of the Australian curriculum as well. Initially, this idea came out of ABC Science from from Bernie Hobbs, who you might know from ABC television. I'll just be one moment. Bernie's original idea is that she wanted a very beautiful 3D visualisation of what happens at nano level for physics, for things like what happens when you actually touch your phone, what physics and biological mechanisms are going on at that nano level. As we sort of started scoping the project, what became evident is that I said, well, there's no use in having a beautiful visualisation. I can get beautiful visualisations anywhere on the internet. And if we've got the money, of course, we can invest them. What we need students to do is to participate, to create, and to actually interact with the material. And the result is that we're just about to send out a request for quotation to several games companies to help for this game to be actualised. We hope that it will be probably built in something like Unity. Essentially, there will be 2 components of the game where there are 3 episodes which students have to unlock, and there'll be a sandbox element there, because I said you can have an interactive game, but once you take any sort of creative sort of element away from the game, students are not going to be interested. So there'll be a sandbox as well where students can sort of see some of this interaction and the scientific reactions occurring. And I know I'm over time. These are just initial artworks. These are just sort of storyboarded artworks. I think our biggest challenge is that what we're going to do, we're going to marry the good people of the filmmaking industry like Stanley Kubrick here, and the good, earnest people of the education industry to get the very best results. There's no use in the independent production industry coming up with an idea and coming up with something with very beautiful production values if it doesn't have educational worth, because that's certainly not going to satisfy our students or teachers. On the other hand, you can't leave things in the hands of educators because they don't necessarily have the experience of the independent production industry. So we've been actively sort of seeking those partnerships. I hope we are not in a position where we have a sort of series of sort of flashcards and very sort of rote learning activities. I certainly hope, although I suspect that somewhere down the track there might be some element of that. Although, as I said before, I do have an adversity to this sort of thing. I think our students, I think families, I think the general community are happy when they are playing, they are participating, and that they are creating. Some of us are strategists, some of us are creative people, some of us are both, but you need to have the flexibility in what you actually build. And this sort of creativity is just what I'm trying to explain, that we do have other sort of elements, and I hope that we have the opportunity to, and I hope that I have the opportunity to explain this sort of creativity and in this approach to the formation of this portal. So sorry about the time, I know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,